Start now. Great. So hello, my name's Hannah. I'm from the National Forest Garden Scheme. Welcome to this part 2 of Tomas Remiarz's talk about guilds. As mentioned in the previous part, we're a members organisation to support and advocate for forest gardens, forest gardening techniques and forest gardeners, and for more forest gardens to happen. If you're interested in what we do, check out our website, check out Facebook, social media, and you can also become a member if you want to. So yeah, have that information. We've organised this as an 8-week series, so check out some of the other ones. That they've all been so valuable, and we're really lucky that Thomas agreed to give up some of his time to come and talk to us about guilds. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Thomas, who's going to explain more about guilds for us. Thanks.
Great, and so I will dive straight into it this time. So after, in the first presentation, we had a bit of a look at how guilds work and what the underlying fundamental principles of guilds are. So, and that, just to summarize that again, if you haven't watched the first video, so there are fundamentally 4 different types of diversity. We can look at structural diversity, which are like the 7 layers above ground, trees, tall trees, smaller trees, shrubs, tall herb layer, ground cover, root crops, and climbers. Then we can also think about structural diversity in a horizontal way across different patches of a forest garden, which could equate to different microhabitats or to different guilds, and or possibly other functional spaces. And finally, also thinking about root patterns as a third type of structural diversity that happens underground, often unnoticed by us, but is as important for like the good functioning of a forest garden. And then we have the ecological functions from nutrient accumulation to ground cover to habitat for insects and so on. Then 2 types of diversity across time, seasonal diversity within 1 year, but also the long-term change that happens through the process of succession. That's like from like a light-loving, light-rich, nutrient-poor habitats to nutrient-rich and light-poor habitats, and the stages in between, and kind of the way we can manage these stages as well. And then finally, there's the genetic diversity all the way from like the 5 kingdoms of life to individual varieties of a particular plant. So what I want to do now is look at a few examples of forest gardens and look at a bit at in detail at how we can apply those different types of diversity. So here's a great forest garden in Lancaster, a small urban one. You know, it's like no bigger than 6 by 8 meters, so it fits in the back garden of Jennifer Laurel. She's a great forest garden designer herself. And so in this picture, we get a bit of a flavor of how structural diversity can look like in a small scale forest garden. So we've got small fruit trees, apple and plum, in the top layer. So they will not grow bigger than 4 or 5 meters maybe, and that can be a canopy. And underneath that, we've got a variety of shrubs. So there's currants, there's roses, there's rosemary. And below that, there are tall herbs like Aquilegia and Linaria, and then smaller herbs and ground covering ones. And there are some self-seeding annual plants like thrown into the mix as well. And so what we already see is that Jenny's done very well in terms of giving each plant individual space so that they can spread out and don't get into each other's way too much. So that's kind of in a small scale intensive forest garden like this, it's quite easy like to stay on top of that with a little bit of management if the initial planting pattern is right. So what we've got here is kind of in terms of structural, like the layers, we've got small trees, shrubs, tall herbs, and smaller ones, and then there are some root crops in there as well. So that's like 4 or 5 layers, and on that scale, that is plenty and will occupy the space above ground, and if the planting density is right, also the space below ground. And indeed, she has got very little problems in terms of maintenance. Just looking at some of the plants that we've got in here. So I mentioned the plum and the apple on small rootstocks, so they will not grow too high and take too much maintenance in the long run. They will live for maybe 20 years, and then you may have to redesign. And so that also defines the time span of a forest garden, the life cycle of this particular forest garden. So that's generally something that whatever the canopy layer is, that will have an impact on kind of how long each particular guild will be functional. Then underneath that, in this case, we've got a rose here. So that provides blossom, of course, for both in terms of nectar for insects, and also the beauty of it is very important to Jennifer. And then it produces rose hips in the autumn as well. So it's kind of as a double or triple yield plant, really. And then we've got the tall herbs here, Aquilegia or columbine, which is a deep-rooted, tap-rooted plant, and Linaria, which is more of a self-seeder, really. So that will like move spaces through the years into any spot where there's like there's a little gap. Similar plant at the back here, Salsify. Again, that's an annual plant, self-seeds very readily, takes up quite a lot of space when it grows, it can do. And it's also a root crop. People grow it as a root crop as well, but the whole plant is edible, and it's also very pretty, and again, insect habitat. And then finally, on the ground layer, first we got a lemon balm here, which is like a clumping plant and can grow quite vigorously. Will also self-seed itself in some situations. And then the oregano, which is more of a ground covering kind of creeping plant. So different types of growing habits, different types of roots as well, as we can already see. And so just like zooming in a bit more into the understory here, we saw the Aquilegia, the columbine in the initial photo. So that's the dark red plant here. And then a great type of plants to include in any forest garden are alliums, so the onion family, and there are many different perennial onions about. Some of them spread themselves very easily, like wild garlic. A lot of them will seed, a lot of them will spread in other ways. And yeah, so you can have a selection of perennial onions almost throughout the entire growing season, like something is coming up there. Then there's yarrow, another different type of root system here, which is like an underground rhizome, really. So it takes up a slightly different space, and again, yarrow is a great plant for blossom from all the way from June through to September, sometimes October. So a long flowering season, it's great. It's a great medicinal herb. It's a great nutrient accumulator as well. And then ice plant, which is like is a really tasty, juicy leaf, which then is followed in the autumn by kind of very showy pink or white flowers. And just another look into the forest garden, and where we see a few more of the shrubs as well. So there's a currant here in one of the other patches, and a blueberry and rosemary, so that they form part of the shrub layer. And then another self-seeded plant here, poached eggplant, which we'll see in another picture later on, which is a very successful self-seeder and can take up a lot of space easily, and also an excellent bee plant. So these shrubs here, as we will see in a second, form actually parts of individual guilds. So if we looking at how the forest garden was developed and is maintained. So that gives us a bit of an idea of like the succession through from like the very beginning to maturity. So this is the garden at the moment of planting, more or less. And as you can see here, one thing that Jenny has decided to do is to like subdivide the space with paving slabs, which of course makes it possible for her to get to a little seating corner at the back. What it also does is it gives the space a bit more definition. So rather than having a like big like 40 square meter space to design, there are just the spaces are much smaller, and we can assign to each space can become a guild in itself, and that's much easier to design a guild of like 3 by 4 meter than by 6 by 8 meter. So there's like much density involved, and I can I can be much more specific there, and it's easier, especially for beginners. So if we're looking at the space 18 months later, so that's the end of the second growing season, we can see already the space is almost completely covered. The idea really is that ideally you want the entire space, whatever ground you're clearing in the first year, you want that covered by the end of the season. And in this case, it's quite effectively. Of course, the shrubs and trees, there isn't that much to see of them yet. I mean, here we can see a bit of the rose bush, and like the apple tree is still very spindly there. But the perennials have already taken up most of the space at this point. So we've got a lot of perennial cabbages here, and they're good to have in the early light-loving phase. Got artichokes here. And so they can take up a lot of space just by themselves, and they will fade later on when the shade starts to kick in more seriously, as a lot of the more the short-lived vegetables. Another thing that is possible with subdividing the forest garden into separate guilds is that we can start playing around with the soil a bit more, with soil and like growing conditions. So in this top left corner here, Jennifer introduced more acidic soil. She used coffee grounds mostly, which acidify the ground, and so that gave an opportunity to plant blueberries, to plant sorrel, to plant other acid-loving plants. And so that's a nice way to again kind of give different parts of the garden a different character. So the next picture, same garden, same view again, and that's in year 7, year 8. And here we can see kind of the canopy is more or less formed. So the apple and the plum are about as big as they will get. They will spread a bit more. They will obviously fill out a bit more. But so that within 8 years, kind of we have really gone from bare grounds to like full forest habitat here, and it doesn't take an awful lot of maintenance time. Like Jenny goes away a lot. She spends an hour a week or less maintaining the garden. So it's by choosing the right planting pattern, it also becomes very easy to maintain throughout the season. So that's one example of like a small urban forest garden that is quite intensively planted, and with great diversity on the micro level. I'll just show a few examples how we can exploit the same idea of diversity and kind of guilds in a much simpler way. So we don't always have to have that amount of diversity and still can have some of the functionality going on. So here's just a 3 species guild, really 3 layers, 3 species. There is a Bramley apple hedge at the back here, in front of which there are 3 keyhole beds, each one with a blackcurrant bush. and underneath the blackcurrants there is a ground cover carpet of poached eggplant. So that's the plant we briefly saw in Jenny's garden, and here it really has taken over the entire ground layer. And if we sow or plant poached eggplant quite densely, then it will, in the right conditions, self-seed incredibly successfully and really take over that layer entirely, if allowed to. And on the other hand, it is an annual, so it's also relatively easy to get rid of, and we could take off one of these patches and plant something else in its stead. So it's while it's very successful, it's also not too aggressive. So it's quite an easy plant to start off with. Here's a picture from a larger forest garden in North Yorkshire, Rachel Benson. She has a focus where she's got over an acre of forest garden, and her focus is really on fruit trees and fruit bushes that she processes and sells the fruit in a CSA scheme, it's community supported agriculture scheme. So in order to maximize the yield from the tree and shrub layer, she planted them quite densely. So it's really, in a way, functionally, like from a design point of view, it's a two-story polyculture of fruit trees and fruit bushes. And of course, there are some plants growing in between ground cover plants. There's like buttercups and grasses and nettles and so on. But she doesn't really worry much about them being there. The nettles actually fulfill a useful function in terms of hiding berries from the birds. So they grow through the bushes, and she lets them grow until she's actually ready to pick a patch. And then she goes to that patch, pulls out the nettles, and at that point, berries are taken off the bush, and she loses very little to birds in that way. And other than that, she just really has left enough space for paths in between to access all the fruit that she's harvesting. So it's a very simple pattern, but very productive and very effective for her. And another simplified pattern here, which is particularly useful for nut crops, the idea of just having trees and possibly bushes with short growing understory, which means that when the nuts fall, they're easy to pick and they won't get lost in like tall vegetation. In that case, it's particularly useful to have plants that grow, finish their growing season before the nuts fall, because then we can just cut everything at that point, and when the nuts are ready to fall, they can just drop and we can pick them up quite easily. And so that again could be with a small number of ground covering herbs, and that place could be quite easily covered. And finally, again, a small-scale polyculture of really just perennial herbs, but again, you can see that they fill the grounds quite effectively and have good diversity of plants. There's sorrel in there. There's various perennial alliums. There's chives. There's Welsh onions. There's lovage in there. There's ice plant in there. So again, a good mix of plants that just takes up that space and and with having enough light, is a good example of a herb bed that can be planted in this way. So just to summarize, how do we apply the diversity concepts in guild plantings? Some rules of thumb to present are designing from the canopy down, so thinking about what is the tallest layer and how does that affect light conditions? Are you planting a dense tree canopy or just a few trees or bushes dotted about that leave a lot of light in between? So that will have an effect on all the lower layers. Then don't worry going like over the top with like a density of 7 layers. It's almost impossible in northern latitudes anyway. So think about like 3 to 5 layers that fulfill the functions that you and include the plants that you want to see in the forest garden. Then good starting point is to think about like what are the key plants, the key species, the key crops that I want to get out of this forest garden, and then design your guilds around them. So introduce plants that that can fulfill some of the needs of those key crops, but also like use some of the excess or like excess products of those crops, and help them to function well. Then the herb layer. That is something that I really can't recommend highly enough. Only clear as much ground as you can cover in a season, because if you clear too much, then very likely like the native vegetation will move in again, and possibly worse than before. And so you will have to start again from scratch. And so it's better to plant a small area densely than a large area like with only a few plants, because the plants in your ground cover want to need to support each other and basically like withstand the pressure of the native surrounding vegetation in order to succeed. So yeah, think about the amount of ground you're clearing from the start. And then another point to make: not everything has to be edible. So think about the supporting plants, the ground cover species, the insect attracting species, the wildlife habitat, and so on, the biomass plants as well. And then finally, think about how will the garden develop in the long run. And it's always good to be with your thinking, to be a step ahead about what's actually happening. So it's like it's a matter of observing which plants are starting to fade a bit. So, and does that mean that kind of their time in the forest garden is up, and you have to replace them with something else? Or are the light conditions getting too dark for some of your like most important crops, in which case you might have to think about taking out some of the woody plants or coppicing them, or steering succession in that way. So working with succession in an active way. And just finally, a couple of reassuring points of view from like some of the main, like biggest experts in forest gardening. So Martin Crawford says that he doesn't specifically plant species X with species Z a lot of the time. He finds that most species get on quite well with each other, and he's quite happy to experiment and see kind of what works out well. And Graham Bell makes the point that the forest garden overall is the guild, and kind of that what is important is finding, like understanding what niches a particular plant prefers, and then putting it into that niche. Combining those niches rather than like thinking about specific species combinations. And with that, you can go a long way and kind of really enjoy the playful exploration of how plants work together and how we can work with plants. So that is a brief explanation and exploration of the guild concept and the different types of diversity that contribute to it. I'm very happy to talk forest gardens with you. If you're interested, do go on my website and drop me an email. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Thomas. That was amazing and so insightful. There's also a part 3 on our website, which is the questions from the original webinar, which are separated from these 2 presentations. And additionally, where we've put the this recording, we should have links to Thomas's website, his book, where you can get in touch with him, and also a link to where he was on Country Files. So all of that stuff will have links underneath. So please do check that out. And there's also, as I said, there's
that's great.
A number of other talks. So please do check out the other talks. There's 8 in total. They're all
I will do.
All with different experts. So thank you very much for joining. And of course, we are a membership organisation, National Forest Garden Scheme. So do check out what we do. And if you want to become a member, please consider it. Thank you so much.